Well, hi everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Welcome to our podcast today, brought to you from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna. And today our guests are Leva Brenner from my own office and Tara Hairston from the Kaspersky lab based in Washington, DC. Hi everybody.
Hi Neil, hi Leva.
Tara, before we start, we explained that we're going to talk today about stalkerware, but Tara, can you introduce yourself for us, please? Tell everybody who you are, how you ended up working for Kaspersky.
Certainly. So Neil, Leva, thank you so much for having me. I work for Kaspersky in the Public Affairs Government Relations team. I've been with the company nearly 4 years, and my background is largely working in government relations. Started out working in a state government here in the US, and then working through a human rights organization, political intelligence firm, and a couple of private sector companies, namely Honda and Kaspersky.
Okay, very good. And Leva, what about you? How did you end up in the UN?
Hi, Neil. So I ended up in the UNODC by starting out in consulting companies. So I started in the private sector, namely in KPMG and BDO, where I worked with forensic investigations before I was lucky enough to end up in your team.
Cool. And for me, I was with law enforcement with the UK's National Crime Agency for probably too longer than I care to remember before joining the UN about 5 years ago. And the beauty of this is that we all have different skill sets. We all have a different background and experience. And today we're talking about stalkerware, which might be a term that not many people are familiar with or understand. Tara, can you tell us what is stalkerware and really why should we care about it?
So stalkerware, Neil, is commercially available software that a person can use to remotely monitor or surveil another person's device, both without their consent and oftentimes without their knowledge. So what I mean by remotely monitoring, it can capture keystrokes, it can look at your text messages, your call logs, your social media activity, and even your location data. So considering, the rightful concerns that everyone has when it comes to issues related to privacy, the fact that this type of software does exist and can be misused in a lot of contexts is why we are talking about this issue today.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. It's really clear. I would get a sense that perhaps this impacts more on women than men. Am I right? Or am I wrong on that instinct?
No, it has definitely played a role in gender-based violence. So whether that's domestic violence or a more broader term, intimate partner violence, and women do seem to bear the brunt of this type of activity. But it is worth noting that the software is available to anyone. So it has been seen in stalking or harassing or even potential violence cases involving people of all genders.
Okay, thanks. Leva, please.
Yeah, so I think quite a few of us might have had some experience with stalkerware, and I think there's quite a few out there who have as well. So I was kind of wondering, could you tell us a little bit how serious this is?
So that's really what we're also trying to address. For Kaspersky's purposes, in terms of the detections for people that have, for example, our mobile security product for Android, we've seen actually a 67% increase in detections related to stalkerware from 2018 to 2019. Now, our statistics are going to maybe be different than some of the other antivirus, anti-malware vendors because we all have different markets and different deployments in different geographies, but we are seeing this to be an increasing concern, and I think that is why we want to try and raise greater awareness about it, not only so that people can protect themselves, but also so that we can have a clearer sense of just how prevalent the problem is.
It's definitely a big problem. Would you tell us a little bit more about what challenges you guys face when it comes to stalkerware?
Sure. So some of the challenges depend on which part of the ecosystem, if you will, that you're participating in. So I'll start with the vendor perspective since I work for Kaspersky. The challenge for antivirus or anti-malware vendors is a couple of things. First and foremost is that the development and sale of this type of software, of stalkerware, is not in and of itself illegal. It is actually legally possible to develop and sell this type of software. The real problem comes down to the misuse of that stalkerware by an individual. That's where typically the legal jurisdictions tend to use their enforcement powers is against an individual that is misusing this type of software. And why that presents a problem for vendors is because if it's legal software, under what justification, if you will, do the vendors have the ability to block it? So the vendors have really been focused on kind of coming up with common criteria, common definition of what constitutes stalkerware in order to make sure that everybody's kind of detecting the same things. And we're providing that information to users so that they can make informed decisions about their own privacy, security, and safety. When you're thinking about it from the perspective of, say, an organization or advocacy group that works either directly, for example, with domestic violence survivors, the challenge there is, do they have enough technical knowledge and capability and capacity to help a survivor determine whether there's stalkerware present on their device? So trying to make sure they have that type of information. But also the reality is stalkerware is just a subset of a broader issue related to tech-enabled abuse. And what I mean by that is that there's a number of ways that a device can be compromised. It could be your abusive partner knows all your passwords, so they're able to, for example, get into your email. They're able to compromise your cloud accounts for iCloud or for Google Cloud. So it's also, in addition to having the ability to identify whether stalkerware may be present, it's also being able to discern whether the issue may be stalkerware or maybe another form of device or account compromise. So there's different challenges depending on the different players within the ecosystem, but those are some of the ones that we're trying to address.
So the Coalition Against Stalkerware, how are you guys going to work with us?
So the Coalition Against Stalkerware launched in November of last year with 10 founding partners, and we have organizations in a number of different countries in North America and Europe. We are very excited to announce that we actually just added 11 new partners just last week, and we've increased the geographic representation throughout the coalition to also include Africa and India. So we're very excited to kind of see this growing sense of community around this issue that is addressing different communities all around the world. And the way that we are interested in working with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is to help better understand the scale and scope of the problem, particularly because that is something that hasn't been really quantified previously. So being able to kind of explain what the issue is really important from an awareness perspective, but also to try and figure out how prevalent the issue is so that we can come up with consensus-based solutions to try and address these issues.
Wonderful. Neil, I'll give the word back to you.
Tara, when you talk about consensus-based issues, those are often some of the biggest challenges that we see in any cyber-related diplomacy. The often really difficult challenges that governments face in defining a problem. So what is stalkerware? How do you define it? You might find it really difficult to get consensus on that. But it seems to me that often we have to look at it from a different lens and through a technologist lens, probably through some sort of service provider lens, that just because you can create something doesn't mean that you necessarily should. And a lot of this will come back to raising that awareness that you rightly say is so important. So from the experience that you've had in the coalition, what does awareness raising around stalkerware look like? Who are your target audiences?
So, Neil, we have a number of what I kind of define as our communities of interest when it comes to the issue of stalkerware. You rightfully raised that, one of the lenses through which we can look at this issue is the technology lens. So, for example, one of the areas that we've really focused on is talking directly to technologists. For example, cybersecurity researchers or cybersecurity professionals. A lot of times people look at the types of abuse that can be enabled by technology, particularly if it is an intimate partner violence situation or a domestic violence situation. They see it very similar to the quote-unquote garden variety cybersecurity issues. And therefore, they provide a lot of the same kind of typical cyber hygiene advice. Just make sure you have strong passwords or passcodes on your devices. Don't share them with other people, things of that nature. And those are still important, do not get me wrong. But the challenge comes in that if you are in an abusive situation, whether it is through cohabitation or otherwise, you may be in a situation where the abuser demands access to your device or uses the line, well, if you really trust me, why do you need to have passcodes? So there's where, that quote unquote traditional cyber hygiene advice falls down. So it's really trying to educate people about what the threat model looks like in this particular context and how it does differ from traditional kinds of malware or spyware that may be out there. So that's one kind of area of focus for the coalition in terms of community engagement. Another one is something I alluded to earlier in terms of the advocacy or the direct service organizations that work directly with people affected by this type of violence or this type of abuse. So it's trying to help them better understand how these technologies and this type of software works, how they can best help their stakeholders and the survivors, try to detect whether this software is present on their devices and what they can potentially do, both in terms to mitigate the risk that this type of software presents, but also what they may want to do in terms of preserving evidence if they decide to pursue investigation through the criminal justice system or things like that. So that's another perspective and constituency we're trying to engage. And then another one that I would say is media. There's a lot of interest in this type of issue and trying to understand understand the dynamics and, again, trying to define the problem. But we think that, again, because this is not a traditional cybersecurity issue, we want to make sure that media is increasingly sensitized, if you will, to, again, the threat model and some of the things that they should be aware of when they're reporting on this issue, because, again, it's not like traditional cybersecurity issues like malware or spyware. So those are just some of the communities of interest that we're trying to engage through the coalition on this important issue.
Tara, thanks for that. That really puts some meat on the bones of the threat that you're facing. And I wonder, do you have any sense yet of the impact or not that quarantine and COVID-19 has had either on the availability, the purchase, the download, or the use of stalkerware?
You know, all of our data, Neil, with regards to how COVID-19 or the pandemic has been intersecting with this issue is really somewhat anecdotal and maybe still at this stage somewhat hypothetical, which seems a little strange being 3 months into the pandemic. Some of the vendors in the coalition have reported an increase month over month, since the beginning of the year in terms of the detections that they're seeing related to stalkerware. Some are reporting a decrease. And I think the questions are still trying to be sorted out as to whether people that are seeing an increase are just refining and fine-tuning their detection, so they're maybe just detecting more. Those vendors that are kind of reporting a decrease goes along with the hypothesis that, well, unfortunately, in the pandemic, all of us are sheltering in place or staying at home more frequently, and that also means that survivors are somewhat stuck with their abusers, particularly if they're in a cohabitation situation. So unfortunately, we don't have really clear sense of how this issue is manifesting itself in this current time, but we are seeing some indicators, or some of our members are reporting increases in advertising related to this type of software. So we're still trying to understand exactly what the landscape looks like, but we're getting somewhat conflicting information. But again, it continues to be a significant problem just because the availability of it.
Thanks, Tara. Again, that's really clear and I think reassuring in many ways that you don't have a full picture of it yet because it's evolving at such a pace. So I think, the reason that we wanted you to come and speak with us and that you were kind enough to do so is I see a real opportunity here for the Coalition Against Stalkerware and UNODC to do a little bit of work to help broaden the awareness of what this is and help the public to understand what it is and how to manage and mitigate some of that risk. And as you said, there are many, many other companies and organizations working with you now, which is great to see. So I think what we'll do in the next couple of weeks is we'll pull together some sort of webinar, public facing event where we can maybe speak with those who have been on the wrong side of this in terms of victims or users, and plus some other members of the coalition so that we can help to understand and maybe get into the detail of this a little more. Does that sound like it works for you?
That sounds like a great idea. I really appreciate the fact that UNODC is willing to convene such an event.
It's our pleasure, and we'll work on that. And for those of you listening, we'll put the information out on what this event will be across our social media as soon as we've got it pulled together. So for now, we'll wrap it up. Thank you for listening. Tara in Washington, Leva in Oslo, and from me, Neil in Vienna, thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.